A very good Friday afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for being here today as we are continuing our study through the book of the Judges, which is one of the important parts of our grander study, which is to walk through the history of the Bible, the story that God has for us within this inspired ancient text, which tells us about who he is, what he has done, what he expects of us, and how he's going to bring about the Savior who was going to redeem mankind back to himself. While we might think of some of the more positive sections of Scripture as being that which we should give greater emphasis to, I think it is important for us as we're going through the text to give great focus to a section such as the Judges, which shows us the very real truth that living without God is going to lead to great heartache, is going to lead to horrible consequences within our lives. And we are seeing that time and time again as we're going through the story of these judges. Though they were tools for God in order to deliver his people from time to time, they were also tools that taught hard lessons. And no better example of that maybe can be found within the Judges story than that of Jephthah. If you're with us last time, we talked about some of the really bad characteristics that he portrayed as being someone who thought that he could negotiate with anyone, even God, in order to accomplish his means. We looked at the paganistic tendencies and paganistic theology that he seemed to hold, to think that God would be pleased with something as horrible as human sacrifice. It really is a sad story to look at whenever we consider Jephthah, but his story does not end at the end of Judges 11. It continues on into Judges 12, and then this chapter is going to conclude with 3 more minor judges from within the Judges cycle. We're going to look at that today, and we're going to conclude this particular block of the story before we jump into Samson this upcoming Tuesday, I should say. Thank you so much for being here with us. With us, as always, is my good friend Alan Seidenstrang. Alan, we're going to conclude with Jephthah today, and we're going to set ourselves up to get into one, if not the most well-known judge within this particular section of Israel's history, Samson. We're not quite there yet. We got to finish up with Jephthah, but thank you so much for being here with us today.
Still got 4 judges to go, but we'll go through them. We'll go through real quick. These are quick ones.
Right, 4 judges, 15 verses. Let's see, my math is right. If this was 16, be 4 verses a judge, but those last 3 don't even get that. Jephthah's going to get about half of this chapter, but there is some within this short chapter that is going to be good for us to look at, because we can draw some connections and parallels to what we have seen earlier within the Judges story. But we're also going to see here one of the telltale signs of just how bad things are getting with Israel, and that is whenever Israel turns against itself. Let's get into this text, Alan. Let's read the first 7 verses together here as we're continuing to get through this Judges story I have here on the screen for you. The Judges cycle, the downward spiral, the Philip Martin, as he calls it, the fatal funnel of the Judges, which shows the negative progression, the digression, we should say, of the Judges in regards to their moral character, their faith, their theology, the way they behave. It's growing worse and worse. We think about that from the standpoint of what Paul says in 2 Timothy, that evil men are going to grow worse and worse. Yeah, that was not unique to Paul's day. It also was happening within the Old Testament, specifically within this block of history of the Judges. They just continue to grow worse and worse and become very, very paganistic in the way they thought and the way they behaved. And we're going to see some of that coming to fruition here within the Judges, and specifically here with Jephthah. Let me stop sharing this, Alan. That way you can get the text up there. And we'll read these first 7 verses of Judges 12 together. The men of Ephraim were called together and crossed the Jordan to Zaphon. And they said to Jephthah, "Why have you crossed over to fight against the Ammonites, but didn't call us to go with you? We will burn your house with you in it." That should bring to mind what we just read from Judges chapter 11, if you were with us last time. And then Jephthah said to them, "My people and I had a bitter conflict with the Ammonites, so I called for you, but you didn't deliver me from their power. When I saw that you weren't going to deliver me, I took my life in my own hands and crossed over to the Ammonites, and the Lord handed them over to me. Why then have you come today to fight against me? And then Jephthah answered all the men of Gilead. They fought and defeated Ephraim, because Ephraim had said, you Gileadites are Ephraim fugitives in the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh. And the Gileadites capture the fords of the Jordan leading to Ephraim. Whenever a fugitive from Ephraim said, let me cross over, the Gileadites asked him, are you an Ephraimite? If he answered no, they told him, well, please say Shibboleth. If he said Sibboleth, because he could not pronounce it correctly, they seized him and executed him at the fords of the Jordan. And at that time, 42,000 from Ephraim died. Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. And when he died, he was buried in one of the cities of Gilead. We have mentioned, Alan, you might have our audience might have seen on that previous visual how a number of these judges and their stories parallel with one another. And this one specifically parallels with the story of Ehud and Shamgar. And within the story of Ehud especially, there is some action that takes place between the tribes on the differing sides of the Jordan River. That really sets the foundation and the background for what we see here today. And yet there are also some other echoes that are seen here that we might have noticed and maybe remember from previous judges. Alan, draw some of those connections for us. That way we can have a better understanding of what's taking place here within the judge's story as a whole.
Yeah, again, the first connection goes all the way back to the story of Ehud. And it talks a lot about the fords of the Jordan. And in that story, it's actually the Israelites kind of united. They captured the fords against Elon and the Moabites and wouldn't allow them to cross back over. They had invaded into the main the western side of Israel, and then after they kill Eglon, they capture these crossing points, these fords, and the Moabites weren't allowed to escape. So the Israelites were able to kill a lot of Moabites at the Jordan River because of that. So it's interesting. There, the Israelites are united. Well, then fast forward actually to the story of Gideon, and you have kind of this crisscross across the Jordan mentioned again. And you have this issue in chapter 8 with Ephraim. If you remember, Gideon was kind of on the western side of the Jordan. And then, well, here comes Ephraim from the main part of Israel. And there was some issue with, helping them capture these fleeing Midianites in chapter 8. And the Ephraimites were kind of mad that they weren't called to help. But Gideon was able to kind of negotiate with them, and there wasn't any more fuss from that. But you see the seeds of this kind of east-west conflict being sown.
Right.
So that was the second one. And now get to this point here, and you still have issue over the crossing points. But now this, what was a unified front in the days of Ehud to a kind of some issues in the days of Gideon now turns into full-blown civil war.
Right.
You have the men of Gilead, which would have been like maybe Gad, Manasseh, and Reuben were on that side of the Jordan. So we don't know exactly what tribe they were from, possibly even from Manasseh, which would have been basically the brother of Ephraim.
Right.
They were both sons of Joseph. So they were even more closely related than some of the other tribes, if that's the case.
Which is why we have what we have at the end of verse 4.
Mm-hmm.
That you Gileadites are Ephraimite fugitives in the territories of who? Ephraim, Manasseh. There we have those two linked together.
Yeah. So what happens now? Now you have Jephthah and the Gileadites. They had this victory. Ephraim's mad that they didn't call him. So now you're gonna. I mean, Ephraim didn't even give him a chance to say anything. We're gonna burn your house down because of this. Okay. Well.
Why is that ironic, Alan?
Well, what did Jephthah just burn up? His own daughter. So now he's going to get burned because of that. So again, these chapter divisions can make us forget the connections between the chapters. If there was no chapter division, then we'd just be reading this straight through, and it would be pretty ironic, and maybe another point for the fact that Jephthah did sacrifice his daughter, because now that sacrifice, that sin, I think, is coming back on him in a certain way. He's having, the men of Ephraim wanting to burn him as well. So it's not mentioned, but it's almost a little bit too too ironic to miss there. But then what do they do? They have this little test to see, if someone from Ephraim, a fugitive, is crossing back, trying to get back home, the Gileadites wouldn't let them until they passed their, dungeon master test here of saying the right, saying the proper pronunciation, which I read one commentator that says, well, that's kind of ironic. I mean, these were all Israelites, right? They should be speaking the same language, but you're already starting to see, you can see how things have deteriorated and have separated them. Right. I mean, obviously they're fighting each other, so that's not good, but you see language differences starting, different pronunciations.
The dialects being different.
Yeah, so you understand that, like in the United States is a huge country. You have regions. You have people speak like Northerners, people speak like Southerners. Well, there's a big gap of land between the two. But the Israelites are supposed to be much more united. We're only talking about 20, 30, 50 miles of land between them. There should be more interaction, people going to Shiloh or wherever the tabernacle is to worship. So there shouldn't, even though it's been 300 years since they came into the land, there shouldn't be that much difference in language and such a separation. But we've seen kind of the east-west divide theme. It started way back in the book of Joshua when the Western tribes were just returning after defeating. They had helped conquer the land, and then they were returning, and you had that whole issue. I think it was Joshua 22 with the setting up the altar of kind of the memorial altar. So they were already starting to fight, get kind of butt heads then, and then times like this where that basically civil war is happening here. I mean, to the point, this isn't just a few fugitives. 42,000 men from Ephraim died. It is, and it's kind of interesting that Ephraim's always the one. They must have. I wonder if they had kind of a high sense of self-worth. If you think about their history, they were the firstborn. Well, they were actually the second-born of Joseph, but back in Jacob was blessing his sons, Joseph received the firstborn portion. And then what happens when he gives that firstborn portion to his two sons? He basically adopts his two sons as his own. And Jacob actually crosses his hands and puts his right hand on Ephraim, the youngest, and his left hand on Manasseh, the oldest. And Joseph tries to fix him. He couldn't see very well. He's like, "Oh, you messed up." And Jacob says, "No." Basically, he's adopting these two sons as his own, and basically giving Ephraim the firstborn, making him the firstborn. Obviously we remember bypassing Reuben and Simeon and all those, even though Judah will receive kind of the more of the blessing, the seed blessing. Jacob makes Ephraim his firstborn in a way. So you understand, and Ephraim does become probably the most the second most after Judah, the second most powerful tribe, to the point where later on, when the nation divides, what is a name synonymous with Israel? It's Ephraim. Right. So Israel, the northern kingdom, was also called Ephraim, and then Judah, the southern kingdom. So it makes sense why Ephraim's got this kind of inflated self-worth, and hey, we should always be called, we should be involved, we're in charge here, we're going to come and burn your house down. So there's a negative progression to that inflated sense of self-worth. But it is kind of ironic, because I don't know that any of these judges ever come from Ephraim. some of them live in the area similar. They're in similar area, but I don't think any of them are mentioned as being Ephraimites.
The
if I remember
closest
right.
ones that they're all around it. I have a little map
Yeah.
that shows the area. Abdon's from just north of Ephraim. Deborah's just south. Ehud's just east, but none of them from within Ephraim itself. That's right.
So there's no great leaders coming from Ephraim. I don't know. I'd have to look forward toward some of the Israelite kings like Jeroboam and some of those guys, but at that point we don't really get it. It doesn't say from the tribe of, it just says their name. So the division of the tribes isn't as key at that point. So it's just kind of ironic that even though Ephraim is supposed to be a leader, Joshua was an Ephraimite. So they have that kind of history, but they've kind of let that lapse at this point. And now, several times throughout the Judges are kind of causing problems. And, to this point, they're basically causing a civil war because they felt dishonored or something. They didn't get a chance to fight against the Ammonites, which the Ammonites were across the river. I don't know what Ephraim's doing crossing the river, dealing with that. That should be a Manasseh, Reuben, Gad thing, but they want to be involved. They want to pretend to be a leader, and then they start fighting each other. So, this is just highlights again just the descent of this whole period. You went from a more united 12 tribes to a very much divided, infighting, bad blood, language barriers, all sorts of things, just causing division amongst God's people. And then as we wrap up with Jephthah here, it says he judged Israel for 6 years. So, it didn't last too long.
No.
That's clearly, that it's not ending on a good note. Like some of the other judges, Israel had peace for 40 years or 80 years or something. He could barely last 6 years. And even in that time, there's already infighting and trouble. So again, just when you compare these to previous stories, that's the point. All these stories are so interwoven that you compare them to the previous stories and you see the natural progression, descent toward just madness and chaos,
which could also be defined very simply as no peace.
Mm-hmm.
No peace and no rest. You don't see the specific mention of there being peace and rest here at the end of Jephthah's story, which as we read on to these 3 minor judges, notice what else is missing as well. In verse number 8, the Ibzan, who was from Bethlehem, judged Israel after Jephthah and had 30 sons. He gave his 30 daughters in marriage to men outside the tribe and brought back 30 wives for his sons from outside the tribe. Ibzan judged Israel 7 years, and when he died, he was buried in Bethlehem. Elon who was from Zebulun, judged Israel after Ibzan. He judged Israel 10 years, and when he died, he was buried in Aijalon in the land of Zebulun. And after Elon, Abdon, son of Hillel, who was from Pirathon, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys, and Abdon judged Israel 8 years, and when he died, he was buried in Pirathon in the land of Ephraim, in the hill country of the Amalekites. What's missing? Well, there's a number of things missing, but what we see being consistent from what has been seen in Jephthah's life is there's no peace. We often look at these 3 judges and the other minor judges as well. Jair, Tola, Shamgar would be thrown in there as well. These minor judges, we don't see there's not much written about them, but again, Alan, whenever we notice where they're at in the story of the judges, we're able to read in a little bit to what is mentioned. So here specifically, we have mentioning of sons, and not just sons, but intermarriages with other people, riding on donkeys. What does all this tell us about who these men are, and really the way that they saw themselves in the structure of Israel at this time?
Just the list of all these sons and marriages. Take Ibzan, for instance. I mean, he had 30 sons. He gave his 30 daughters in marriage to men outside the tribe and brought back 30 wives. So it would seem like I mean, what is he trying to do with all this, marrying outside the tribes? He's trying to, I think he's trying to unite, the people with him as king. I mean, that would be a great way of doing it. If you can, you know, why would the Ephraimites fight against you when one of their sons married your daughters? I mean, that's the point of those types of marriages.
Mhm.
You try to make peace with other people. So obviously 30 wives and 30 sons, you can pretty much, have uh, you know, a treaty marriage with just about anyone you want when you got that many. So he is clearly setting himself up as some kind of king. Um, did you read which Bethlehem this was? I assume it's not the.
I think the northern one would be the one this would most likely be pointing
Yeah, that's
towards.
what I figured. So seems to be the northern area seems to be more happening, at least in the book of Judges, whereas later on it's going to be Jerusalem and Judah that is takes more of a lead, and more of the more of the politics happening down there with Jerusalem. But it seems like this is kind of the center of the nation at this point in the northern regions. So that would make sense that he would kind of set himself up right there, and then scatter his kids out in marriage and try to bring peace and unification, but also power to himself. And then, of course, so you have Abdon, 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. We've talked about just the symbolism of riding on donkeys. Why would you even? Of course, they rode on donkeys, from time to time. It's just everyone had donkeys to get from place to place. But to mention that, and especially, sons and grandsons, now he's trying to establish his line as
Mhm.
in a kingly way, establish his sons and grandsons in authority over many different regions, many different cities. Uh, One thing I've noticed in these last couple judges, the time frames are very short.
Mhm.
Ibzan judged Israel 7 years, Elon 10 years, and I think Abdon was 8 years. Well, that's not very long. What were earlier on, Othniel, and then they had peace for 80 years, and Elon, I think 40 years. These were like 2 to 3 generations of time of peace because of those earlier judges. Well, now, I mean, maybe 8 years, 10 years, 7 years, like that's really only enough time for maybe a defeated nation like the Ammonites just to kind of recover from a defeat and then come back and attack them again. Like this isn't really peace. This is like the calm in between two storms.
Mhm.
I think of the history of the 20th century, like World War I, World War II. You study that time period, that there was about maybe 10, 20 years in between those two wars. It was, even though we separate them, they were very much united. There were a lot of connections between the two conflicts. It was just happened to be some time of peace in between, just as you know things were gearing back up again. So that's it was an uneasy peace here for maybe a few years, but not a long established period of actual rest and peace like you might have had earlier in the book of Judges. So and I think I saw one other connection, this idea of marrying outside the tribe, I think kind of leads into the story of Samson as
Right.
well, who obviously his issue was marrying outside the nation and, marrying these Philistine women. So you have some connection forward, and then you have some connection backward again. That's what's fun. I hadn't really done a study of the judges before, and to see how all of these even minor judges kind of fall into the narrative and help us connect things back and forth is really kind of cool.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Since we're talking about the lack of peace, the lack of rest, and instead of there being real peace and rest, there's more just kind of a timeout, almost just a little bit of a pause and waiting for the next thing to happen. I mean, the last time we see anything about real rest would be Gideon, or right before Gideon. Since then, which would be Abimelech, which would be Jephthah, and then here with Ibzan and Elon and Abdon, there's not that's missing. Well, why is that? Well, because the further they get away from God, the less there's going to be peace. And they continue to go through the cycle that we mentioned so often of being rebellious against God, God bringing up an oppressor, them crying out to God, God then raising up a judge, and peace being reinstituted within the land. Once they showed themselves to only be going through the motions in that crying out in repentance, God said, no, this is where you want to be. As I mentioned last time, if you want to play in this sandbox, I'm going to let you, and you're going to see just how miserable it is. It's going to be miserable to be in this type of an environment where God is not with you because you don't want to be with him. And that's exactly what we see. I mean, once we get into Samson and his story, I mean, it almost seems as if Israel's comfortable with the oppression, that they've just kind of settled in. Okay, well, this is just how life is going to be. And that's so sad, because that's not how life was supposed to be for them. This was supposed to be a land of rest, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that gave them everything they needed in order to be successful. And yet they had squandered that, absolutely squandered it through paganism, spiritual adultery, through this up and down yo-yo type of living where they're cool with God and then they're not cool with God, and they cry out to God, and then he's just frustrated and is weary because of their difficulties. It's just a bad spot. And if you're reading this for the first time, I think if you're unfamiliar with the history of Israel, once you get to the end of Joshua, leading into the first part of Judges, you probably wouldn't think that we'd be in this place at this point. You thought that they'd be set up in a way that they can simply thrive through their obedience. And yet it is their disobedience and their lack of faithfulness that's led to where they are today. And really, Samson's story itself is an embodiment of where Israel is at this point in their history. And that's where we're going to get into next week. Do a couple chapters on Tuesday and finish up Samson's story on Friday. Before we get there, though, Alan, do you want to close? Anything else you want to share today? Anything you want to mention to lead us into those Samson studies for next week?
Yeah, just it's kind of fun to we do kind of get a switch over with Samson here. We first part of chapter 13, you kind of see that cycle rearing its head again, and I love that Samson comes right at the end, because you're thinking, okay, surely something's got to change at this point. Like, we're getting toward the end of the book. Surely God's going to send someone better than what we've had. And you do get that hope with Samson. There's the Lord, an angel comes to his parents, and you have this. There's obviously we know the whole picture of the Bible. We know that usually happens for someone good, like John the Baptist or Jesus himself. So there's going to be a lot of parallels to these really important people of the Bible, Jacob and Esau. There was kind of foretelling about them, and Isaac, and then. You think, okay, good. He's the one. He's going to rescue everybody. And then, nope, sorry. It's still going to get worse. And it goes right back into, the whole story of Judges and the funnel and the decline. So it's almost a little tease in the next chapter.
Yep, that's what we're moving towards. And we look forward to you joining us for that study this coming Tuesday. If you have any questions about our study today, any questions about where we've been so far in Judges or in the entirety of the text that we've covered up to this point, please feel free to reach out and let us know about those questions. We'd love to walk through the text with you if we can do that. We hope that this study has been a blessing to you as we've been going about it. I think we are on, I think today is episode like 68 of our study. So we are moving closer to that 3/4 century mark, and who knows where we'll be at episode 100, but we're looking forward to getting there whenever we get there. It's been a good study for me, and I hope that the same can be said for you and for Alan as well. It's been good to be in God's word, and we thank you for joining us along this ride. If you're looking for a church to worship with on Sunday, we'll be meeting at 384 Pleasant Plains Road here in Jackson, Tennessee at 9 a.m. for a period of worship and study. It's be Valentine's Day on Sunday, and I promise this is purely coincidental, but we'll just so happen to be in Mark chapter 10, talking about marriage and also the issue of divorce for our study as we've been going through the Gospel of Mark. Hope that you can join us for that if you're able, whether in person or here online on Facebook or YouTube. We look forward to that time together. And if you have any questions, again, if you have any needs, please reach out to us, the Pleasant Plains Church. We'd love to serve you in any way that we can. Again, thank you for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your Friday and a good weekend. It's supposed to be a cold one, I think. So hope that you're bundling up and staying warm wherever you are. God bless you, and hope you'll join us next time as we continue our walk through history, the story of God's word in the Bible. Samson's coming up. It's an exciting one. Hope you'll join us for that as well. Take care, and God bless.